Today's session will talk about execution of the audits or IS audit, and we will cover majority of areas such as general computer controls and application controls. General computer controls, or as others might call ITGC or information technology general controls. You could use those two terms in exchange. You could exchange those two terms. Part of the execution phase is a detailed assessment of the IT components to obtain reasonable assurance that the IT controls are adequately designed and operating effectively to mitigate IT risks. We've talked about yesterday during the planning, as we were saying, do you want to cover all IT systems? But here it's say, okay, IT components to obtain a reasonable assurance that IT controls are adequately designed, operating effectively to mitigate IT risk. So we will also later talk about design, evaluation of the design of control and evaluation of operating effectiveness of a control. So in this case, as you could see from this is step 2. Remember, we've put 3 steps. So second step is once you understand also the entity level controls, because that is part of the execution. Initially, after the planning, we talked about governance. That is one part of also, as I said, in CISA, this is IT governance is a module or an area that needs to be looked separately. Yesterday, we talked IT governance and IT management. Today, we'll talk about general computer controls and application controls in general. Let's talk about the sampling methodology. So in order for you to test, there are 2 ways. We've talked about different evidence gathering on the first day. But once you decide that I'm going to test, and when you say I'm going to take a sample, then now you've got 2 choices, statistical sample or non-statistical sampling. So those are the things we will be talking about today. Sampling is performed when time and cost considerations preclude a total verification of all transactions or events in a predefined population. So as we've said before, if you have transactions that are 1 million or more, or hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, you cannot cover all unless you're doing a data analytic or a data dump. So in order for you to cover, then the way to do it is to sample. IS auditors should design and select an audit sample, perform audit procedures, and evaluate sample results to obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence to form a conclusion. That will be very not different than how do you go about your sampling. If the AGP has a sampling methodology, then you could follow that sampling methodology. It's no different than what we are trying to present here. Yesterday, some of you might have mentioned at the end of the day on how to utilize this. As I said, it's no different than financial when you're looking at compliance audit or compliance testing or what we call test of controls. So you will approach it the same way once it comes testing and also controls testing. So evaluate operating effectiveness controls in preventing material weakness, detecting material weakness, or correcting material weakness. Evidence gathering for the purpose of testing and organization's compliance with control procedures. Remember, we've said you could consider it as a compliance because at the end of the day, what you need is you will have to establish a criteria, be it a policy, be it a regulation, be it a procedure, be it the standards. Once I have a criteria to check against it, so it's a matter of do they meet the criteria or not. So from that perspective, it's very similar to compliance. So once you identify your own criteria on the IT, be it a system, be it a process, be it a person's access, once you identify a criteria, your testing is basically, does that meet the criteria or not? But first and foremost, you'll have to establish the criteria. That's why standards, frameworks, regulations, policies, all of those will help you to establish a criteria that you're going to test. Determine whether controls are being applied in a manner that complies with management policies and procedures. So here they talk about policies and procedures. It could be regulation, it could be framework, it could be standards, it could be a guidance. So that is what you're looking for. Substantive testing or test of details. Yesterday, we've briefly touched on this. A substantive test substantiates the integrity of actual processing. So IS auditor could use substantive tests to test the monetary errors directly affecting financial statement balances. IS auditor might develop a substantive test to test the completeness and accuracy of report data. IS auditor might use a statistical sample which will allow the IS auditor to develop a conclusion regarding the accuracy of all the data. The example is performance of a complex calculation, such as interest. You'll use a substantive test for that, or a sample of accounts or transactions. You could use either a sample in that case of a transaction. So when we say statistical sampling, it determines the sample size of and selection criteria, uses mathematical laws of probability to calculate the sampling size, select the sample items, evaluate the sample result, and make an inference. Statistical sampling permits the IS auditor to quantify the probability of an error. We talk about confidence coefficient. That probably your methodology might go into detail. Basically, if I'm testing a process or a control, based on my understanding of the mandate, my understanding based on the walkthroughs that I have conducted, I would have to formulate an expectation. I already know what criteria I'm testing against. So if my expectation is that they are very good and they will meet, then my coefficient confidence might be 95 or above. What that means is I will select a sample, my error should be very little because my expectation is set. If my expectation remains that, let's say, and I took a sample of 30, for example, and I found 2 or 3 errors, now the result does not match my expectation. Either I have to change my expectation and now realize that the system is not working well and conclude on that, or if I want to maintain my expectation, now I could increase the sample size. Instead of 30, it will become 60 because I want to see whether that fulfills my expectation or not. In doing that, if I don't see any more errors, then my expectation still would be within that coefficient. Let's say I found 3 or 4 more errors, which means my expectation was wrong. Because now the sample is telling me not only the first sample, but the increase, the secondary sample is also showing the errors. So that is majority how you conclude your conclusion of that process. Either at the beginning on your first sample, you could conclude, or if you still want to maintain, or you're thinking based on your walkthroughs and the observations that you've done, this might be an anomaly, then you could increase your sample size to see if your expectation would hold based on the testing that you're conducting. To be a statistical sample, each item in the population should have an equal opportunity or probability of being selected. So that is one of the conditions of when we talk about the statistical sampling. The probability of picking each one of them have to be equal. That is one. Secondary is when I am doing a statistical sampling, the population that I'm choosing have to be what it's called homogenized. It has to be similar. And then when I select, each one of them have the same probability. So that is what we call a random sample. So it's a random sample, opposite to non-statistical sampling. If the population is not the same, then that is when you need to divide the population. The ones, each one of them now could have its own sample because the populations are not the same. So the population have to have the same characteristic of those transactions, and it has to, the probability have to be equal on each of them being selected. Any questions? Non-statistical sampling. In other words, what's called judgmental sampling. So you will use your judgment on, let's say, I will pick the first 5, I will pick the last 5, I will pick middle 5. Maybe that's how I would choose. It's a judgmental. I'll pick the highest figures, I'll pick the lowest figures. Again, it's judgmental. But it's still, whatever judgment that you use, you really need to document when you are choosing that population. And you really need to be clear and saying, this is a non-statistical judgmental sampling, and this is the judgment I use to pick. Because remember, the rule of thumb is whoever is reviewing, whether it's your bosses or a third party or a QA, should be able to follow your logic or your documentation in order to come to the same conclusion. So you'll have to document your thought process and how you came up with the sample. So it has to be on your file. So if it's statistical, you'll say statistical sampling, random, this is how much I choose. My population was this number or this also timing, and then I chose this. If it's non-statistical, then the same way. This is my population, non-statistical, which is judgmental, and this is the judgment I used to pick. So it's exactly what I just explained. Any questions in regard of statistical sampling, non-statistical sampling? Those. So now we go into the test. Since we now understand how to pick those samples, be it statistical or non-statistical, now we have to do the testing. So in order for us to do the testing, now we have to understand at the process level, as I said, I have to formulate an expectation that will be based on the walkthroughs, my understanding of the process, also my understanding of the mandate, my understanding of their policies and procedure. So before I start the testing, I need to have a good understanding of what criteria I'm using against. So how would I get it? Part of it is walkthrough and testing of control implementation. The purpose is to confirm the auditor's understanding of the flows of the transaction, procedures, controls obtained as part of the process understanding. That's exactly what I was talking. In order for you to identify your criteria, you need to understand the process and the laws, regulations, whatever that process is already established. So establish your criteria. That's the purpose. When you have to determine if the control is in place or used by the entity. Once you understand, a lot of times as you do your walkthroughs, one thing that is good for auditor is to see actually if this has been put in place. That will help you two things. First and foremost, it will help you understand when you're doing your sampling, how does the documentation or how does the actual activity of this control takes place. Let's say if I'm talking about procurement, and one of the controls is, let's say, the approval. How is that approval materialized, or how is that approval done? Is it by signature? Is it by email? Is it by any other method? So by doing the walkthrough and also checking one sample to see actually how the documents or how that activity takes place would help you when you make your sample. Now I understand what to test and how it's manifests itself, the control. So once you do the work to determine if the control is actually in place and used by the entity. So it also helps you understand what do you expect, the documents that you're receiving, how that control is manifested itself. Perform selection of sample and trace it through transaction lifecycle. So a lot of times, as I say, procurement, it's much better. When I pick an item, I'm not only testing one part. Remember, procurement, let's assume it's 10 controls within the whole cycle. If I'm picking a sample, I'm not going to test only one control out of that. I need to take that sample throughout the life cycle, because that shows me if it went through all the process that it should have been. So don't test it just the approval part. It's a control approval, but different transactions with different controls. No, take one transaction, and if there is a life cycle of that process, let it go through the whole thing. So your test have to show all the control. Let's say it's a 10 control, then I'll put all the 10 controls in there. I'll put my samples here, and then I will answer yes or no if they meet the controls or not, based on my understanding, based on the criteria. And then you need to document the relevant details, name, position, the person interviewed, and the unique characteristics of the sample that you took. So walk through when you document. Testing, as I just explained, when you are testing, you really need to document. The criteria, as I said, you need to document. When you put all the 10 controls, you need to explain each control, what it is and what are the criteria you're testing. And then the result would be shown also on your test sheet. Any questions in regard of test of controls and how to go through this? Just shows you a quick process of the testing. Correct. That's what I said. If the process is a process that has a life cycle, let's say from A to Z, as I took the example, let's say there is a 10 controls on the procurement. If I pick up a sample purchase, I don't want to test only, let's say, the contracting part of it. I want to test from beginning to end of that transaction. So that's why I was saying, don't test only one control on your sample if there is a life cycle. Let that sample go through the whole life cycle, because that gives you the actual picture of that transaction instead of just one aspect of the control on that sample. Number one, it helps you your assurance in regard of the transactions and whether they went through or not. Secondly, it also reduces the amount of work you have done, isn't it? Let's say the 10 controls. If I pick a sample and only run on the first control, what about the second control? Now, do I have to pick a new sample for the second control? Third control? So instead of, let's say, 30 controls going through the 10 processes, if I pick, that would be the 30, isn't it? If it's a 10 controls and I'm picking different sample on each control, we're talking about 300 sample. See the difference? And still it might not give me, isn't it, an assurance of whether each one of them went through the 10 controls or not. Yeah. So that's, any other question? Comment? So we looked at how to test the control on a quick overall understanding, identify your criteria, pick a sample, and then test against that criteria. So when we say testing of a control, actually what we are talking about is two things. We need to initially test the design of that control, whether it's adequate to mitigate the risk. And then secondly, as we talked about, is it being implemented is one, but now I need to test it operating effectiveness. When I say operating effectiveness is, does that control, remember, as we said, worked all across? Also, timing wise, is it being done across the time period that we were talking about? Was it effective, that control, that it hasn't changed? Because that is, at the end of the day, what we are looking is the annual budgets and annual financial, isn't it? For that annual, does that control being effective along those timelines? So the purpose of evaluating whether the control individually or in combination with other controls is capable or effectively preventing, detecting, or correcting material misstatements. So that is what I'm evaluating a control design. Basically, what I'm saying is, does it detect, prevent, or correct a material misstatement? Not only material misstatement, but that it prevent, detect, or correct the risk that I identified. Remember, each control or multiple controls might be addressing one risk. So even though we said material misstatement, that's the highest level, but what guides you again is the risk. When I identify a risk, I need controls that mitigate the risk. So when I am evaluating a design, that is what we call a desk review, because I'm not taking a sample or anything. I'm just reading the control the way that it's the way that it's written in the policies or in procedures. What I'm looking at is, does this mitigate the risk that I identify? If it doesn't mitigate the risk, then that is inadequate design. I don't need to actually look at operating effectiveness in that case, because the design of the control does not mitigate the risk. An improperly designed control may represent a significant deficiency in internal control. there is little point in assessing the implementation of control that's not effective. So there's no need for you to go take a sample and look operating effectiveness when the design is flawed. When you are looking at design, you're looking each control separately. So yeah, design of controls. We're talking about design of controls. Yeah. Not about what? Network is network is a whole system, isn't it? So you need to choose. When we talk about controls, we'll be talking about, let's say, a password parameter. That's one control. I mean, network is a big thing. If we're talking about firewall, there are multiple controls that could be. So we're talking about one control here. It could be something that is configured or coded, or it could be something that is, as we call it, an IT dependent control, like provisioning and access. So we're talking about the design of a control. Control is an activity. So we're talking about an activities design. So the way to evaluate is, does this activity mitigate the risk? So if it does mitigate, then it passes. If it does not mitigate the risk, then it fails. Any other question? If you guys need any clarification, please do ask. If it's not clear. Yes. Because when we say adequate control, it means that on one side of it, it means that its design is good. When I say adequate control, it's the flip side of the coin. If I'm looking at the design is adequate, what I'm talking about is the control, adequate. So it could be interchangeable. Okay, try to explain as an auditor from your perspective, what does it mean control is adequate? Okay, so what does it mean? It detects, isn't it? Okay, so control is adequate. I'm taking it as a two-part. One is the way that you said, is it preventing, detecting, or correcting? But that is on, how do you decide that? I could decide that by reading it, isn't it? The control, as it is documented in the policies or procedures. That is why I say that's a desk review. That doesn't tell me whether it's effective. So there is a difference between design adequacy or operating effectiveness. So at what you say, I could say, while I'm reading a document, I could say, yeah, that's an effective. No, that is a adequate control, but it's a desk. I'm not testing the activities. I didn't take a sample. So when I take a sample and testing it, that I'm testing operating effectiveness. Does it work, this control, as is designed? So that's the question always, what I'm answering. Is the control working as is designed? That is operating effectiveness issue. But as I read, in conjunction with the risk, then I could say it's effective. Sorry, it's adequate. Because I could see it mitigates the risk. It detects, it prevents, and it might be correcting it. So it's adequate. But is it actually working? So one is just to read the way that it's written and decide whether this is an adequate control. Secondly, is did it actually took place during a period? So that is operating effectiveness test. So that is where the difference between adequacy of the design and then operating effectiveness. So when we say control is adequate, that's why I said explain it to me. If you're only talking about the design of it, I'm talking about desk review. I'm basically judging or evaluating the way that it's written. Does it prevent, detect, or correct the risk? So basically, what is preventing something bad to happen, the risk to materialize, or detect if it already happened, or correct after it happened, the risk. So different ways or steps or evidence gathering. We talked about how to gather evidence, isn't it? I mean, inquiry, which is interview, observation, and testing. We've looked at reperformance, as we said. So one of the ways or different ways of doing your control design testing is you could do an inquiry supported by inspection of document testing. Or as we said, when we say documents, we're talking about two. First, the one that gives me the criteria. And secondly, when we say take a one sample and look whether it's being put in place or not. So that shows me the design, and also it shows me how that is actually manifests itself in real. So, and here you could see you are combining different evidence collection or different testing, as we call it, because inquiry it's also is a test. So different evidence gathering methods you are combining in order to give you a high reliability. Because if you only inquire, yes, I read, but I asked somebody and he said, yes, it's fine, it's working. Would I just stop there and say the design is adequate or implementation is fine? No, I need to corroborate that. So I will either observe, or in the first case, I will say, show me an example of it. Just one example to see if it's been put in place, but also to see if what is written is being translated. Another way of doing it is inquiry or interview and observe. So you could interview and then say, okay, show me if you're doing those transactions or those activity, how it's done, without interfering. Observation is you don't interfere, you basically stand behind them, let them do their job. Another way of doing it is inquiry or interview, and then you reperform. You try to do the same thing. If it's reconciliation, if it's something that it has to allow, the control has to allow a control that could be reperformed. Because if we're talking access provisions, you're not going to do an access, give access to somebody. But depending on the control, then you choose which is the best method for you to do so. Interview is always one, it includes, but what is the second method that you could use of evidence gathering to corroborate? Now we move to test of operating effectiveness. So once you identify or you conclude on the design of the control, if it's adequate, now I have to test it. Is it working effectively during the period and the audit? So gather sufficient appropriate audit evidence of operating effectiveness of the controls, in particular, how the control were applied at relevant times during period and the audit. That's exactly what I just said. The consistency to which they are applied, by whom or by what means they are applied. So on the first, as I said, based on the design, when I took one sample, then I should at least know this. But once I take my sample, then I will know how is it being applied by who, and the consistency shows me my sample have to be across that period. It shouldn't be on only 1 day's transactions. It should cut across the period and the review. So that is why if you are doing an interim audit or in the middle of the year, don't take all your sample at that stage. Take the sample, but leave some at the end of the year, because what you are vouching or what you are providing assurance is the whole year, or shouldn't say year only, the period under your review. So as some have said before, if I'm reviewing 2 years, then I need that 2-year transactions. My sample have to reflect those 2 years. So what I'm vouching or what I'm giving conclusion is that the whole 2 years operating effectiveness, that this control operated consistently across the period. So when you choose your sample, if it's, let's say, sample of 30, don't do it all at interim. Because if you didn't cover the rest of 6 months, 2-3 months, whatever the rest of the period is, then you're not covering the whole period. So just keep that in mind. Identifying a control deficiency. A deficiency in internal control exists when it's unable to prevent, detect, or correct misstatements or basically the risk itself on a timely basis. It's missing to prevent, detect, or correct risks in a timely basis. So it's the same. So there are mostly three categories when we talk about control is not working. So as I said before, if I found, remember we talked about the sampling, statistical and all of those, even if it's not a statistical, when I found deficiencies in a control, let's say I picked a sample of 30 and 2 of them are not working out of the 30. So my conclusion, again, remember, sometimes also we're talking about the process level, not only one control. So at the process level, if 2 of them have failed, 2 of my sample in different areas, I need to, initially I said you have an expectation whether the control should be working or not. So now when I received, I need to conclude. So there is 3 ways of concluding when control is deficient. One is a control weakness. It means controls is not working as operating effectively, but it's not causing me a bigger problem on the whole of procurement. There are other controls on the pipeline that either prevent, detect, or correct it. So when that is the case, or it might not give me a rise to a financial misstatement. If that is the case, then you will say it's a control deficiency or control weakness. So that is the lowest. Yes, there is an issue, but it does not compromise the whole process, let's say procurement process. Because even those 2, they might have, out of the, let's keep that example, out of the 10 controls, 1 failed one failed on 2 controls. So they didn't fail the whole 10. It means it doesn't compromise the whole process. Secondly, you might have the same 2, or maybe let's say either 3 or 4, or the 2, whichever one. If you have 4 that has, each one of them has either 1 or 2 controls, now you could see the control is not operating effectively. Even your sample, you have a large number of exceptions. Or the 2 itself, but it failed, let's say 5 different controls in each one of them. Because now the process itself, it's impacting the process. So you could still say that it's a weakness, but that's where significant weakness comes in. So instead of a control weakness, now it's a significant to the whole process. Thirdly is, if I take this procurement, this 10, let's say the 5, the 2, or there are either 4 exceptions that have different 1 or 2 control deficiencies, or 2 that has a 5. Now I question, is this just a process level, or would this impact my financial statement? So if the process, let's say, was a security, I might have to go to the application, I might have to trace it. How would that impact the financials? It might or it might not. If it's not, it will stay as a significant deficiency. But let's say we were talking about procurement. Now I could directly link to my financial statement. Now I'm not sure about whether it will have an impact, material misstatement. Then that is the highest level. So it could have a material misstatement, because now I cannot rely on the controls. Those controls on the procurement could have a material financial misstatement. So those are the 3 categories mostly when we talk about control deficiencies. So it's a control weakness, significant weakness, or material financial misstatement. So here it explains when we say control deficiency is significant or significant deficiency. So you might consider the following factors. The likelihood of the deficiency leading to material misstatement financial reporting in the future, maybe not now, but it could raise later on. Susceptibility to loss or fraud of the related asset or liability. So it might cause that. If the entity level control deficiency leads to application control to fail. So remember, we said if we were looking GCC or entity level control or access, would that lead an actual, remember, would that have an impact on the whole process, meaning the applications that are underneath it? If it causes, then it's significant, because now it compromises the whole process. The deficiency, is it pervasive, such as undermining the control environment? So those 2 are very similar, isn't it? Is it pervasive? Does it compromise the whole process or the whole organizational process? is the deficiency should be evaluated in aggregation with other entity level controls, GCC, application, business lifecycle. So that's why I said, look at it through the process in this case, not only itself, as I said, one exception. Let's say if that process had like 2 different life cycles, so don't only look at it on one, but look also on the other. Would it also compromise? Let's say if we are looking at procurement, but we were looking at, let's say, authorization of what to buy. That decision applies everything else, isn't it? So if that is deficient, then it could lead the rest of them to have a proper, or even if the rest is working, it doesn't have any bearing. Like, let's say direct order. Remember we talked about yesterday. If I give conflict of interest, if I'm giving a contract to my brother, receiving the amounts and all the other signatures and quotes and all of those could be working well, but once the first one, my initial approval, the rest wouldn't really make, so it compromises the whole. So if it's pervasive, that first mistake. Also, when you're looking at it, sometimes don't look at it only the control itself, but look at it, multiple controls, let's say, that have failed. So either sometimes when you're evaluating individually, or sometimes you will have to evaluate, because remember what we're talking about, you've done the work, you've done the exercise, the exceptions have been raised, it's on your test sheet. Now what you are looking at is conclusion. So now I have to conclude with these controls. Is it weak? Just a control weakness that it doesn't compromise the process or the whole entity or the whole, let's say, IT, or it does. If it does, then it's significant. Then you will look at it, okay, with this significant process, undermine or create a problem for my financial statement. If it's yes, then it's a financial, is a material financial statement weakness of the control. Any questions in that regard? First,
the material control deviation at design stage, we will report it immediately, or going either we will go for further test of control and test of control.
If a control design is deficient, you don't go any further. Depending on the, I don't think you will report directly, because that just comes as part of your final report. But don't and confuse 2 things. If I come across, let's say, based on that, I come across potential for fraud or anything else like that, then you might have to communicate that as quickly as possible to the client management and to your management. And then you will continue your audit, and then it will show up on the report, on your report. Yeah. But you don't need to do any more sampling, unless, let's say, if it's potential for fraud and you want to see and quantify if there is an actual fraud, then it's a different case. That you could do it. Say it again. Okay, if I understood your question, I think what he is talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is the difference between substantive testing or the control testing. I think that is what he's getting. So in the case of, because substantive testing, including substantive analytical and test of detail, gives you assurance on the balances of an account or a class of transactions. So in order for you to reduce your substantive audit, that's why you do internal controls testing. What he is asking is, if design is deficiency, if there is a design deficiency, yes, you're not going to take a sample to test it. Now you might have to increase your substantive test of that you're doing normally. That is one thing. But also you have to realize what I've just said. Substantive testing, as we're talking about, is either class of transactions, let's say such a procurement, or a balance, such as goods and services account, depending on how many accounts are there. So let's say one of the accounts. When we say control design, if we are talking about one control design deficiency, that's why I said you really need to look at it. Is this the whole process? Does it compromise the whole process or that whole account balance? If it doesn't, then the rest of the control, you could still conclude, as I said, that it's a control weakness, but which means is like overall, everything is working well and you don't have to increase your test of detail or substantive testing that. But if it's significant, it means that the whole process is either corrupted or the whole process, it has an effect on the whole process. Then now, anytime more than control weakness, if it's a potential material misstatement, definitely you need to increase your sample on the test of detail. Or if it's actually significant, which means that it compromises the process, then you might have to increase your test of detail. But if it's only control weakness, then you don't, because it's basically an anomaly that you could say. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Sure.
But here you are not able to. I would like to know the scientific statement you emphasize as if we have asset value in the present statement, so I think it's asset value like 1 million rupees asset value, so different asset. But if location, physical location is not identifiable, and it's only monetary term based on historical growth, not on real term. So, my question is why they can locate the asset so that they can check physical, because you have real system. They are saying that they are using the tagging method. You can listen some representative of they are tagging the asset, but that tagging method like 5 years and still working on it. So my question is just say there still how I check the physical data and how I can utilize it as a real statement or real estate.
I understood well. I have very similar experience on that. My latest client that I have been working as. Fixed assets was a big issue, exactly as you said. It wasn't tagged, and the locations cannot be, but then you have a number on your financial statement on fixed assets. It was different, actually 3 different, similar to what you said, it took longer time, 3 different auditors, which were private, especially Big 4, 3 of them had the same problem. So basically you are disclaiming about this account balance, saying that you noted as your deficiency, you said, because some of your tests, like if you show up on a place that, let's say, location cannot be identified, so in order for you to test, right away, that's a deficiency, isn't it, on the control? So you note that. And another thing is like you could also note the possibilities depending on what type of depreciation are they using, on the life of the asset. Is it because if I cannot even locate, then how would I know if I have it 5 years, because that is also accounting policy, isn't it? What accounting policy are they using in regard of depreciation? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 if it's more? Especially on different assets, it could have a different life time, such as chairs or computer. So even that, are they maintaining it? How would they know? Because I have to keep changing, isn't it, based on that life? So I have to do a depreciation, book it to the depreciation and reduce the asset value. So all of those, how it's done. So now I'm questioning all of that process. And I have to put it in my report. Another question also, or another that comes in, because when I'm doing a financial statement, I'm initially declaring what is the materiality, isn't it? So even though I'm reporting, then I have to also look at materiality. The amount of fixed assets, in this case, will be total amount of fixed assets. Is it material or not? From materiality standpoint. If it's material, then I would have to also almost disclaim about that account balance. If it's not material, I might not be disclaiming the account balances, but I am actually still writing the deficiencies and the exception that, again, that's what we are talking. Now it's a significant because it compromised the whole system. So it's a significant, and I will say it that way, it's a significant deficiency on the assets or the fixed assets. So those are the way that I will address. So at minimum, it's a significant deficiency. All you need to know next is basically, if your materiality is 1 million rupees, if the fixed assets is more than 1 million, then it's a material misstatement on that level, on that account level. No, but that's what I said. When I am evaluating one control, I will look at it, okay, is this, because when you test, here when we're talking about, like you've done your test, yes or no's, because that is when you're focusing, okay, this transaction does it meet, remember, let's stay on the 10 controls on procurement. Now, if I'm testing authorization, I took a sample of transactions, could be 30. So I'm going through the 10 controls, does it meet yes or no? So initially that's my thinking, isn't it? Yes or no, yes or no. But when I finish, that is when I say, okay, then what do I see? Approvals. Maybe 2 of them didn't have an approval. Okay, that's a problem. I go through each column or each control and all the one. Now I'm trying to conclude what I'm finding. So is my finding control weakness? We try to define control weakness, what it is. Yes, it failed, but it does not compromise the whole process. Then it's a control weakness. If I see all the controls have failed one way or the other on my sample, then now I know it compromises the process. What you are explaining now to me is definitely it compromises the whole process. So that's why I said at minimum, it's a control and significant deficiency. So my second stage now is, okay, so now I see there is errors on each of the controls. That's a significant deficiency. Now I will take one more. I say, okay, what was my materiality? So I could refer my materiality and then see what is this account balance. If it's more than my materiality, then it's a material misstatement. It's a potential, I'm not saying material mistake, it's a potential for material misstatement. Now, as he was questioning, now I need to look at from my substantive or analytical or test of detail to prove that it is a material misstatement. So in this case, I could pick, let's say, some of the assets, and I could say, okay, could you show me even these assets? If they cannot, then it's a proof that that is a material misstatement. Or I will take a additional sample in regard of my test of details that gives me that materiality level. If I could prove that those either don't exist or obsolete or they are not commissioned or working asset and they are still reporting, then it's a material misstatement. So basically you will go through those 3 levels. The first level, and also when you are evaluating, remember I said, yes, you're evaluating one, but also not only one control, but in conjunction with the other controls in order for you to conclude. So this is the conclusion stage on your testing. So when I conclude this is a control weakness on the process level, or it compromises the process, which means it's significant, or does that affect my financial statement, which is a material misstatement it could cause. So those are when I'm concluding, remember, after my testing is my conclusion. So that's what I look after the testing of how I should be concluding. Any other question? Or a concern, or anybody wants to share? Anybody wants to reflect on their client as he did and see if they need any clarity or any input? Okay. General computer controls or information technology computer controls. It's a detailed assessment of the IT components to obtain reasonable assurance that IT controls are adequately designed and operating effectively to mitigate the IT risks. So what are those areas when we talk about IT general controls? Let me just explain what the IT general control is. We will look at it here. So let's look at the depiction that I did last time. When you are thinking IT general controls, always think of it as like a fence. Because it fences around the applications. So when we say IT general controls here, what we mean is call it policies and procedures. Information security. So it sets what are the general rules on information security, like the policies and procedures in regard to information security. So that's number one. System development and acquisition. It's not talking about one application, but this is giving you the policies and procedures of how we develop or how we acquire systems. So those are the controls, remember, not only one app, because it applies on all the applications, all the hardware. So here, not only applications, we're talking about also hardware. When we buy or develop applications or buy hardware, what policy do we have? Does the steering committee approve? And this is a GCC level. That's what we call general computer control or IPPC. We are talking about if we're talking about, let's say, IT part of IT operations in help desk, isn't it? If somebody's having a problem with their laptop, or if somebody's having a problem with a printer, if somebody's having a problem with the hardware or an application, then we call the help desk, isn't it? So the rules of the help desk and the SLAs of the help desk is at GCC level. But it doesn't matter, the issue is hardware is an application, the rules and the policies are set at this level. So that is what we, when we talk about information technology general control, that's why it's called general controls, because it encompasses the rules that are set up at that stage, encompasses all the systems of an organization. So it talks about protection of assets in general, not on a specific. It talks about information systems development and acquisition on a lot, what processes that it has to go through, approvals, testing, and all of those that it sets. So it's not about a specific item. And then the same thing it sets about operations. Help desk is one, how they go about. So still it's let's say departmental level. Below that, you could have application specific policies because that application, but it's still, this is guides. Second one comes under, when it comes to network, let's say, of one of the hardware firewall, it could have a specific rules of those firewall, but the initial rules of access would still apply at the GCC level. So that is a general rule of thumb to understand. So remember when we were talking about deficiencies on controls. So if something, let's say security policy or security provisioning, if a control fails at GCC, if I need to know, remember when we say, okay, I'm concluding. If I'm concluding, I'll go through that process that we were saying, isn't it? Okay, now it failed. Would this have any impact on the application? So now I'm looking, does it compromise the process, the whole process? Because this was at GCC level. Now I need to understand, would that compromise also my applications below it? If it does, then minimum it's a significant deficiency. If it does not, then it's a control weakness. And then I could trace it also down. If it affects the process, compromises, it's a significant deficiency, isn't it? So now I need to know, okay, if that process would have impact on my financials. So I will use that thought process when I'm concluding from control process level and then financial statement level. It would have, if it has impact or not. So the same thing, anytime you have a problem with ITGCs, what you need to think about it right away is, if I, especially at the conclusion stage, if you want to conclude on security system development, would that have effects on the applications? Or my sample, was it actual application that has been either implemented or acquired? Was that application and a significant application on the process? Because if they are buying a ticketing system, it's not the same as if they are buying the procurement system, isn't it? We talked about help desk uses system, it's a ticketing system. We said if IT is new and I'm buying a new ticketing or customer management system, that might not be the same weight as a procurement system or HR system. So we need to understand also when you're concluding definitely what system also affects my financials. Again, that is on the annual universe or an IT systems universe. Remember we said, try to identify the people, try to identify all the assets, systems. So when I'm identifying, I might have to be mapping, this system is for HR, this is for finance, this is for this. So I know what systems they are using and what function, especially applications, and what function that application is playing. Is it something to do with their finance or mandate, or is it, how would I say, helping them within the internal work? Like help desk ticketing system is very internal work. It has nothing to do mandate, but it's a tool that they are using for efficiency or effectiveness. That's completely different when we're talking about the impact of the mandate or the processes. Any question? Yes. It is part of the general computer controls. They came under the information assets, protection of information assets. Because what does network does? It transports information, isn't it? So what is important is protection of that information. Because that is where actually network comes in. It's an appliances that transport basically data or information. My concern is that that is protected. So whenever we talk about network, aside from implementation of it, it has to be implemented in order to use. But my number two on my number one, from audit, my number one is the security. Anytime people talk about network, what they talk about, either the IT talks about them getting the latest technologies maybe, or acquisition of it, or let's get this appliance or that. But anybody outside, when they talk about network, what are they talking about?
Network servers are also boundary of our,
Here, when we talk about boundary, we're talking about system. We're not talking about geography. So there could be in Islamabad, but if it's within the system, I mean, Islamabad and Lahore, geographically, they are different. But if we're talking about IT systems, they could be connected, isn't it? So they are on one system in that case. Again, what connects them? Network. Yeah. So network is basically connectivity. From IT perspective, that's why I say they're one of the latest from IT perspective is connectivity. From audit or anybody else's perspective, is it secure? Now I have connection. Is it secure? So it is part of the GCC because it connects. Once it connects multiple systems. It doesn't connect only one system. There are some applications that might be required direct connection, but it's using the infrastructure that others is using. Even if it's they create a virtual private network, VPNs for them, or virtual, or what they call nowadays, they could segment the network, but they are using the overall infrastructure. They might segment, they might tunnel, they might do things to separate it, but it's still within the same infrastructure. So it falls under GCC. Because if I'm changing anything on that infrastructure, I need to follow same policy, isn't it? I don't follow different policies or different rules. Okay, let's stop here, give you a quick break for prayer, 10, 15 minutes, and we will be back to continue. Well, okay, guys, we will start. General computer controls. So it is a detailed assessment of IT components to obtain reasonable assurance that IT controls are adequately designed, operating effectively to mitigate the IT risks. So that is what the areas within the general computer controls are protection of information assets, information systems acquisition and development and implementation, information systems operations and business resilience, or in other words, business continuity and disaster recovery. So let's start with protection of information assets. What, how, and why? The first thing, what, is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. In other words, those three words you could consider as your information technology or information systems assertions. You are looking at confidentiality of the data, integrity of the data, and the availability of the data. Those are the most important when we're talking about, or assertions when we're talking about information systems or technology. How are we going to look at it? We will look at the policies, practices, procedures. We'll look at the organizational structures. We will look at the software functions and software policies. Why are we looking those? Part of it could be competitive edge. It could be legal compliance. We talk about some countries that have a legal requirement, such as privacy. We could look at an image, and we could look at it effectively, efficiency or profitability. When we talk about information security or protection of information assets, what are the different levels of the areas within IT security? So we might be talking about, or different areas, or what we mostly call layers of security. It could be network security, it could be the internet security, operating system security, application security, database security, physical access. security. So some of the others might be called and lumped together called logical access, which is basically the access definition is the access of the system that's logical. Physical access is basically how a person could either walk in or take an item. So such as data centers, any of the items that could easily be carried. So we need to physically secure those or think about physical security of those areas or items or assets. What are the audit controls that we might be thinking? System security settings are appropriate. That's one of the areas we could be looking at. Access definitions or privilege functions are limited to appropriate individuals, especially the admin super user privilege access are few. Access to programs and data is limited to appropriate person, so that goes access definition. So access should be given based on job requirement. When access is given, the user has to be authorized by the specific authorization requirement. So you might have an authorization matrix. Physical access to computer hardware is limited to appropriate individuals. The same thing, the data center should only be allowed people who have a legitimate reason what their job requires. So even within IT, people should not be accessing the data center. Segregation of incompatible duties is an area that we should be looking at. Network security and monitoring is an area that we should be also looking at. We've already talked about data center environmental controls. It's also very important because that is not only security, but how could you secure that asset if it could easily be damaged by environmental hazard? So we need to be thinking about it. Heat, dust, all of those might damage your hardware. So these are the areas that we'll be looking at. These are the different layers of security you could be thinking about it. Network, database, applications, operating system, internet. Basically, is your network, we talked about network diagram, isn't it? Is your network only you, or are you connected to the internet? So if you're connecting to the internet, how data goes out, how information comes in, it has to be secured. And within your network, then you have to know, am I using firewalls? Am I using DMZs? What is my network design? So in order for you to do that, then you'll have to specifically walk through information security and the different layers of information security, the people who are responsible. As we talked about this morning, initially you'll have to get as part of the governance organizational structure. So once you get this organizational structure, then you're supposed to know who's dealing with network, who's dealing with database, who's dealing with applications, who's dealing with, so you will have an idea who you should be talking to. So once you identify that, understand and walk through the IT security processes that your entity has. Inquire IT management, their processes for managing each type of IT security above. So the different layers we talked about, what are their processes? What are they doing it? How are they securing those assets or those processes? So security parameters, configurations, like at the network level or at the Active Directory level. Account setting, would account have any lockouts? If it hasn't been used for 3 months, 6 months, or similar, do they have a policy for that? Password, do they have a password and parameters that are already been established as a policy? Is there any firewall strategy that exists? Is the entity using encryption, and how are they using encryption and how they are managing? Is there any audit trail logs, or is there any logs to begin with? And if there is logs, then is there any audit trail logs? Audit trail logs means specific exceptions or specific activity that you are specifically, it's not about auditors. It's just called audit trail logs. It's for management. Remember, we talked about management monitoring. We talked about privilege access or admin access. So if I need to know what is this admin doing, I will request, because remember, log will capture everything. So if I, rather than everything, I only need, let's say, what is the admin accesses so IT director could review. So that is what we call audit trail logs. It's very specific for activities, specific exceptions, basically a specific reporting that captures the logs for a specific purpose. So those are your audit trail logs. In general, also, what are the security settings that you are looking at? Definition of access privileges. We talked about that. Rule of thumb for information security access is that access should be given based on job responsibility. In other words, rule of thumb is need to know basis. So access should be given only when you need to know for your work. So in order that to happen, then access has to be defined before people start the work. Meaning, if I'm hiring somebody, I should know what his access or her access should be. I don't use, as the person come in, I don't just copy somebody else's. I know access has a defined matrix. If you're data entry person, this is what you have. If you're approval, this is what you have. If you are reviewer, this is the access that you're supposed to have, whether it's an application or anything else. If you are just walking in, a lot of companies, at least on the private or even on the public, the first thing they will give you is your laptop and then your network password and ID, so basically network access, maybe your email, maybe if there is any self-service for HR. The rest of them would be depending on your job requirements. So it has to be given based on your job. Maybe those three or few of them are general access that everybody gets, but even that everybody doesn't get, like drivers or somebody who's not using systems would not get also those. So access always have to be commensurate or appropriate to the job responsibility. And in order that to happen, then you have to do an access definition. You have to define access prior of what each person or each group should have. Again, when we're talking about testing, remember we said criteria, then that becomes your criteria to ensure that access is appropriate. Now you have a criteria, which is your access definition that's been defined. If I'm checking new hires or that came in or transfers, now I have a criteria to check against. Another area to look at is segregation of duties. One is I know what access did they have, and one is I know what their responsibility is based on the org chart. Now I could compare, is this an issue of conflicting access that the person has? Data center environmental controls, we talked about that. What do we mean environmental control? Have we explained that before? Okay, so when we say data center environmental control, what we are talking about, data center is where you are housing your servers and your other big appliances. I mean, so sometimes your switches and all of those are on your data center. Those have to be protected, not only physically from who could enter and out, because they could easily pull the wires out, isn't it? And it will shut down everything, or they could easily copy directly from the server. So you don't want people to have access. So that's physical security. Secondly, what we call is environmental controls, because if you've ever been in a data center, or if you're in a server, instead of a server, your computer, the bottom part of it heats up, isn't it? The servers also do the same thing, and it's even more powerful. So if you have multiple servers in one room, it will get very hot. And if it doesn't, then it will burn the equipment, basically, or it will hurt the equipment. So in order data center, that's why you really have to chill data center in order the temperature to be at certain level. So in order for you to have a certain level, so you have to control the weather, basically, in that room. You have to control the climate in that room. So it has to be chilled. So you have to establish a range that it should be. So you have to, basically, it has to be air conditioned. That's one. Secondly, you need to make sure that there is no dust coming into that room, because dust also would affect your systems. In case of fire, what do you need? You need something to alert fire. So you need to have a fire suppression system also. That fire suppression system cannot be water, because water will damage your equipment. It has to be gas. It has to be, ventilation have to be done, not only the cold, because the air has to be circulated. So you have to raise the floor, and air has to come from the bottom, so it could circulate. So You lower the ceiling, you raise the floor, you have air conditioning, you have fire detection, you have also water detection, because you don't want a place that could easily be flooded, because that also will damage. That's one of the reasons also in conjunction with the airflow that you will have to raise the floor. So below it, at least, even if there is any water that comes, it could just either have a drainage below it. It shouldn't affect your equipment. So those combined, you also supposed to have a UBS, uninterrupted power supply. So if the power goes out, you don't want those to go down your systems. You want to have uninterrupted power supply. On top of that, if electricity goes out, uninterrupted power supply could only help you 1 hour, 2 hours. It's a more of a transition, but you wanted to have a generator that could pick up if the power outage is a longer time. You have to have a diesel or whatever that system uses, or that generator uses. Electricity, as it comes into the data center, you also want to have a redundancy. You don't want one line, even if it's a one company. If there are multiple companies, then you might get two companies as a redundancy. If it's one company, then you might have to get the electricity from two substations. So at least if one goes down, the other is still working. So all of these combined, plus all the things that we talked about, the fire and alert system, the fire protection system, the water system, the UPS, all of those, you need to maintain it. So as an auditor, you really need to look at it. Is it actually working? Is it being maintained? Because mostly it's an outside companies that either implement it or would be able to help you maintain these items. So you have to periodically check. Client has to do the entity, but as an auditor, we need to check whether these are maintained, because having something that doesn't work doesn't mean anything. So maintenance, or at least companies that are come to check it, basically to inspect it, would help you get assurance that these will be used when it's needed, or it's usable when it's needed. So those are, when we talk about data center environmental controls, those are the things that we are talking about. No, database management, that is just, a database is one system that houses the data. But what we're talking about is where that database sits physically. So that is data center. That's what it's called, data center. It's basically where your appliances, the hardware, servers are all housed. That is a, yes, no, data center is where you house your physical and equipment, basically. IT equipment. Database is tables that are housed. So database is very similar to, if I say application, it's a system database. It's not a physical location. It's a logical location. It's completely different. Because the servers, one server could be a database server. Database, it's a logical housing for the data, basically, if you want to look at it that way. Where data center is a physical housing of equipment. Any other question? Okay. When we look at user access management, that's what we also call logical access. So how they are doing access have to be defined, we said. So when we're testing, we could look at new users, transfer users, or users that left. So terminated users, would we say, or inactive. You'll have to put it. So are they managing that? How are they managing those? We also look at roles and rights. Do they also do periodic review of access? Because that is what we call either corrective or detective. If initially, when people left the ministry, if they didn't take off their access, if you do periodic review, that's again where you could pick it up, isn't it? You took a sample and one of the person has been terminated 1 year ago or 6 months ago. Why does he have still access to the system? So periodic review of access, they should do, management should do, that is as part of their detective or corrective controls. So not only that you put initially control, remember we talk about when you are evaluating control, you look at the multiple controls. So this is in addition to the first layer of control. When people get terminated, HR is supposed to notify IT, IT is supposed to take their access out. So that's your normal course. Periodic review gives you a chance to correct it if you haven't fixed it in the first place. And then monitoring and reporting, the same thing. Periodic review could be a way that you monitor terminations or even access is appropriate. So also there are other reports that are monitoring if for security reasons. One of the ways is whether it's an application, a folder, or anything. If somebody is trying to access an asset and they are denied, you could easily find a report that shows you access denial reports. What does it tell you? If somebody is actually, that is also another way, or one of the ways, even if it's small, to identify a hacker. If somebody is keep trying to access something that he or she is not allowed, it doesn't matter whether that person is internal or external, you know that there is an issue, isn't it? But if I'm not monitoring that, I wouldn't be able to pick up or see that. Sometimes even internal, I mean, something you might try because people are curious if you could just open something, isn't it? Asset, whatever it is, or to pass through. But if somebody is persistent, then you know there is a reason behind it. So you really need to be able to question. It's like, why are you trying? Because access, remember what we started. Access is need to know. Access is commensurate or appropriate to job responsibility. When we gave you access, it means that you have no business in looking at these other areas. So why are you trying to get access to it? These other assets. So one of the ways to do is denial of access is one report. So there could be multiple other reports. Another report we talked about is for monitoring is privilege access, admin, super user. Somebody needs to look at those. Are they doing what they're supposed to or are they not? Because their access gives them a lot. Another one that people will look at, let's say, is moving code to production. I need to look at that. Did they move anything? And if those has to be something that has been authorized. So people who have access or have the ability to move code, people who have access, let's say, to the firewalls, are they changing the firewall setting? If they are, then they might have been authorized. If they did, but without authorization, then you know there might be a problem there. So monitoring and review within the security domain is also important. So I have to identify what are my high risk areas, and then I have to review those, be it on access denial, be it in privilege access. So person who have access to the network or firewall, as I said, those are privileged. Everybody doesn't have access to those. So privilege accounts, admin, super user, database administrator, server or system administrator, those are administrators, admins, super users. Those are accounts that are privileged, so you need to review those. Somebody needs to review, not auditors. I'm talking about IT management. Needs to review those to ensure that it's adequate. And a lot of times, some of them, they're used, especially if there is a code movement, changes on settings, then those have to be approved because those have to go through change management process, which we will talk about later. But from security perspective, you need to look at it. Okay, change management is one thing, but from security perspective, is this activity an authorized activity or not? Any questions? So one of the questions you can be asking is there any IT security policy, or is there a plan drawn up, approved at the appropriate level? So before I carry over the details, as we talked about access definitions and configuration settings or standards, operating system security, database security, all of those, before I even go into that, first of all, do you have policy that regulates those areas or standards that you should be following? Does the security plan include or cover the following? Complete set of security policies and standards. Exactly, that's what I said. All the different layers have to have a policy and the procedures for implementing those policies. Who is responsible for those? Remember, we just talked about the admins and all of those. Then I need to know who's responsible for network, who's responsible for operating system, who's responsible for database. So I identify that. Plus, I will look at, did you communicate the policies? Do these guys know what they're supposed to be? Also, Are you communicating to the rest of the entity? Awareness, IT security awareness is very big. We talked about password sharing. How would people know the policy? I need to make sure that the people know the policy. I need to communicate to everybody. Don't share your password. I need to have posters from their screen, different ways. I need to send them. I need to have a meetings. If I want quarterly or monthly, I need to communicate the policies, especially the ones that affect the general employees, like don't share your password. Be cognizant of phishing emails, like cybersecurity. When we're talking about, it needs a security awareness. I need to let them know every time what is expected. Code of ethics sometimes do have those information, but a lot of times code of ethics you sign the first day you join, 30 years later, you don't even remember what it says. So awareness, security awareness is a key. Information technology or information security awareness is a key. Is it being done? If it's not being done, then that could be a problem also. It's a weakness, because if your policies and procedures, your standard, because remember, it takes a person to do the work, isn't it? What do we say about a control? It's an activity. And what could break a control? Activity could break a control, isn't it? Somebody gave me an account and a password. If I share, I broke that. My expectation is not to share. So if somebody doesn't communicate with me and doesn't repeat and doesn't say, okay, if I do, maybe I'll be penalized, I'll be punished. So even awareness is important, to know people, to let them know. So when we look at the procedures, access rights, we talked about access definition matrix. So that is a specific procedure. Are there any authentication or authorization mechanism, such as passwords, tokens, digital signatures, for enforcing access rights according to sensitivity and criticality of information? So each asset or each critical information might require a different way of authentication. One way that we all know is password, but there are a lot of times that tokens, either OTPs would come, or sometimes biometric, whether it's your eyes or fingerprint. Data centers a lot of times requires what we call dual authentication. It has to be verified twice. So maybe it has a PIN code on the entrance, on the door. You might have seen doors that have a PIN code. Some of them might require your physical access card, like an employee access card and a PIN code. Sometimes it is the access card and your biometric. So those are, or normal applications, sometimes when you log in, it might ask you an OTP. That comes straight to your either email or phone. Then you need to use that, not only your password, but plus the OTP in order to get. So it's verifying twice, because if your password is compromised, now the person have to also compromise the secondary layer of authentication. So that is why, depending on the criticality, you might require secondary authentication or two-factor authentication. So has policy being defined and implemented concerning physical security, access control measures that are to be followed to prevent fire, water damage, power outage, theft, etc. at the IT premises. Mostly when we talk about IT premises here, they're talking about the data center. A lot of times data center might have, as I said, two-factor authentication, but as a detective, they might also have cameras out and in. So whoever went in, if I wanted to know, I will be able to see also through the camera. So that could be another layer of security. And most of them they require, is the camera there? Is the camera working? Is somebody reviewing the camera? Because if the camera is there, but nobody is reviewing it, then what is the point of having a camera? If a camera is not there, then you don't even have eyes on the data center. Is there a procedure for logging and monitoring all access to data center? A lot of times, if people who sold you the server are coming, let's say, or the maintenance people, we talked about maintaining fire, UPS and everything, isn't it? They need to get access to the data center, but they're not your employees. So they have to be escorted by your employee and they have to sign the log. So I need to be able to see who came in, who. Also, the camera shows me, and now I have two, isn't it? I've seen on the camera somebody. I could go to the log and say, did this person signed in? So it's different ways of maintaining control and also ensuring that you are aware of what's happening in the data center. So contractors, vendors, they have to sign the log. Maybe you gave them a temporary card, but remember it's dual authentication, so card alone doesn't. Nobody will give them a biometric access or let's say a PIN number for the thing, but the access for the card only allows them just to show that they are visitors. That access, that card is not actually opens the door, maybe the main doors, but definitely not the data center. But the reason you're logging them is you want to account who came in, who left, because if any problem happens and you're investigating, you want to see who came in at one time. You could use cameras, but also you've got the log as a double verification. When you do the walkthroughs and your understanding, you need to document your understanding, even if it's security. Anytime you are working in an area, we said policies and procedures, rules, laws, standards, you need to know, isn't it? To set your criteria. You need to do an inquiry, interview, do a walkthrough. Combine those two and document your understanding of the that area. So if I'm assigned IT security, then I will go through with the different layers. I will find out what are the policies, what are the standards that they are using, what are the people who are involved. So I will document all of that. If the process has a flow chart, I might also do a flow chart. If it's a cycle, I will do a flow chart showing how that cycle goes and who's supposed to be approving what or who's supposed to be doing action on what stage, in order for me to understand, not only for me, but anybody who's reviewing this file later on, whether it's QA, management, or third party that will come tomorrow. Again, the reason that auditors document is the rule of thumb on audit documentation is that a third party or anybody who's an auditor who didn't work in this job could review and should be coming to the same conclusion. So I need to document my steps. Who did I meet? What did I understand? If it's a cycle, a flow chart for the cycle, that's what we call process understanding or process narrative. So process understanding, including your walkthroughs of the area you are assigned, have to be documented. Documentation should contain processes of the client where there are different procedures for each type of IT security. So if you're looking application or specific application, then I have to have a separate document walkthrough or understanding of that application. If I'm talking about other interfaces, if I'm talking about data base security, if I'm talking about operating system security, I need to document it separately. If I'm talking about network security, I need to document it, my understanding and process walkthrough separately. So our job is to evaluate the design and implementation of the controls. So in this case, IT security controls. Based on your understanding, evaluate, is the control designed effectively? So we talked about previously, isn't it? First thing you will evaluate is what I call desk evaluation. Is when I read the standards and when I read the policy, is this adequate for the risk? If it's adequate, then I say design is adequate before I do a sample or a test. Let me just clarify one thing. I think it also might have come yesterday. For information technologies security controls, some of them are what we call manual controls that are dependent. Like let's say when we're talking about monitoring, the report by itself, remember what we said, control is an activity, isn't it? So report alone is not a control. Somebody reviewing it makes it the control. But some of them, such as, let's say, password parameters, since I am setting on the system, I said one time and the system behaves that, isn't it? If I say the password parameters, you guys have been into applications or other things, whether it's online or not. If the password parameter, let's say, length is 8, if you put 6, it will not allow you. It will tell you password is 8. If it's complex, let's say if it needs alphanumeric, it will tell you. It will not allow you, which means is on the system, if I set a policy on that system, it will behave that way until it's changed. So the reason I'm raising this is if I'm testing it, I don't need a sample in that case. All I need is just to get a screenshot of how password parameters is set. Because it will behave that way all across. So for any pure IT coding and configuration, its testing only needs one item. It doesn't need a sample. But if I'm looking at, let's say, access definition, the matrix is there, but how access is given, it's manual. It's almost like the person has to key in what privilege this guy have, or have to assign existing user that has a privilege to the person. So I have to take a sample of all the new hires and then look at how access has been given to them. What they are, even if I have access to the system that I could read, but initially my sample have to come from HR, and then I have to compare what access the IT has given them. So just to differentiate those, what you need access and what is what you need a sample for, and what you need only one item that will suffice your control testing requirement. So once you decide about the effectiveness and conclude the design test approach, procedures may be the same as walkthrough. As I said, always when you're checking the design, is it adequate? Means, does it mitigate? Basically, does it detect, prevent, or correct? At the same time, what you are asking is, or in addition to that, actually, not only design, is to see actually has it being implemented. So that's why I always say, just take one sample to show that it is. If the case is, let's say, parameters, just as I talked, so your testing of the design and the implementation will suffice also for the operating effectiveness. In this case, let's say the password parameters. If I get at one time when I'm doing the walkthrough on the design, let's say the policy says it has to be 8, and then I get a screenshot to show that that's actually been implemented, that will suffice my operating effectiveness also. I don't need to take a sample, as I said. So always, has it been implemented, take one sample, because that helps you, as I said. If it's something that has to be, let's say, user and access, remember I said you could take a sample, but it might need an approval, because there are other things that are not only on the system that you are testing within the process. As I said, it's a life cycle. The person requests it, somebody approves it, and then somebody gives access, isn't it? If I need to test that, then I need to take a sample. How those approvals would look like, that's why I say take one sample to understand the actual process, how actually the control or the controls are manifested in real life. If the control that you're testing lend itself to be sample, then you take a sample and you test it. Obtain a complete list of different types. So basically get the population, in this case, example that we've already used, new users, what we call, or new employees. So you first have to say, okay, if I'm looking at 1 year, give me the total population of all the new hires. Then I could take a sample of that. If they are 100 or more, then I will take a sample. If they are 5, then I could test all 5 of them. So it all depends on the population when you're taking a sample also. Remember, we talked about evidence and where do you get. So in this case, I'm not asking IT. So to make sure that the sample is complete, I'm asking HR. So I need to see, so I could verify all the new hires from HR side. Once I know that it's 100 or it's 5 or whatever the number is, I verify it's a complete, then I could go and ask IT, where are the authorizations and how did you give them access based on the access definition matrix? Any question so far?
If we have a specimen of audit design matrix,
Say it again.
there is a technique audit design matrix.
Audit design matrix. I'm not familiar. Specific.
Yes, but
Yeah, governance talks about, we've talked about governance. Governance talks about different areas. Strategy is governance. policies and procedures or standards are governance, organizational structures is a governance area. We talked about the risk management governance. So those are the big components. This is probably what you're talking about, a specific tool that is utilized. It's very similar, I think, what you're talking about is audit, not working paper, but audit program.
What we place is there is a list of audit queries, and against that we have a test result.
Yeah, that's a testing sheet. I mean, not one, but that's your audit. That's what I said. That's an audit program. So I could put my audit program of what I want to test. Let's say now we are talking about security, isn't it? So if I want to put an audit program for security, all the different layers on the network, let's say I have 3 steps that I need to do, and then database, how many steps that I need to do. On network access, how many that I need to do. Application, how many. So once I put all of those each, then that becomes my audit program for security. Yes, then you will have to, each of those items, I might have to have a separate testing, especially if it's a sample based, but later I will be coming back here, update the result I received, because this now audit program is where I will remember what I said about the conclusion of the controls. Now I could evaluate individually or an aggregate, because now I have the audit program that shows me the overall security, all my tests or my security audit work, what can I conclude? Whether it's only control weakness, significant deficiency, or material misstatement. That also depends in, you could have a generic ones, but it all depends. Remember, we said you'll have to do a walkthrough, you will have to understand the environment. So even if you get a generic audit program, which you could get it from the internet, either AuditNet or ISACA or different places, it's a very good tool, but you have to adapt and customize it to your client, because whatever policy your client have decided, then that is what overrules your audit program. Because if certain services they don't know, they don't use, then it automatically, that area you're not going to use. Some of them might or might not be also specific to technology. Like if I wanted to do an Oracle, I could easily get an Oracle based, or SAP. If you want an SAP security, you could get SAP security and work program. So some of them could be specific, some of them could be general. And those exist. If you search, you will be able to find. Somebody could provide you. So one thing that is very important is, if I'm picking a sample, as we talked about, let's say new users, I say, go to HR, don't talk to IT. If I wanted to see an help desk, let's say change management or issue tickets, I need to get that report. Yes, they will offer me, but I need to verify that the system has the same population that they have given me. So I need to be able to verify the completeness of the population that they have given to me. So the client manual list of changes, if there is a manual, if it's automated from the system, if they are keeping a manual one, then I need to go to the source before I accept that the population is complete. No, it's not. It is not. Because remember, when HR is entering new employees, they're entering the new employees onto their HR system, isn't it? For payroll and other. In this case, I'm not looking payroll, isn't it? I'm looking at what access that the new person has been given. So I'll get my population from HR. HR is using that same population for another reason, for payroll, for pension, for other things. But my testing is not pension or payroll in this case. My pension is The new person, let's say person number one, what access that he has to the systems. That is my test. I'm not looking what payroll that he's taking, what is his wages. So what I am looking on what HR is looking is completely different. So HR cannot even tell me what access he has. IT will tell me. Since I'm testing access, I'm not asking HR something that has anything to do with HR. But in the case, let's say on changes, IT changes, I'm asking IT, but instead of them, I will ask, how are they actually logging? If it's manual, I need to show me the actual manual logs. Because remember, I am coming after the fact. And if they, whatever list that they have given me, they try to play with it. It's only the one that they gave me. They're not going to change their records for me, because if they change, then it will affect them operationally themselves. So I need to verify. If it's system, then I'll go directly to the system. While I'm observing, I'll say, okay, run a report, show me that totals are the same of the population that you gave me. If it's manual, then I will easily ask, show me the book that you're logging in all the changes. If it's a spreadsheet, then I will ask them, show me, just open the spreadsheet. Before I take the sample, I need to get comfort that I have the total population. Remember, especially if I'm taking a random sample, I say that each and every one of them have to have the same probability. If I don't even have, let's say, a quarter of the population, then automatically that doesn't meet the criteria of the sample. So that is the importance. Whenever you're taking a sample and whenever you're looking at any population, you need to verify the completeness of that population. There are different ways of verifying, depending whether it's something is manual or system. If it's system, it's very easy. You'll just say, rerun the report. Because a lot of times when they're giving you a population, remember, they're giving you in a spreadsheet, because the spreadsheet, you could easily delete whatever numbers that you don't want. But when you go back and say, okay, rerun, the totals have to match. Then this is just an example of change management. So if I have to get change management, here we said, okay, in order for me to understand, I have to first get the population. I have to verify that the population is correct, either through the system or through manual. Once I have selected my sample, then I need to test. So select an appropriate sample of changes from the list obtained, refer to guidelines on selecting test sample size. So you could follow whatever number of size, you could follow your methodology. IS Audit or IT doesn't have a separate. So whatever way that you have a methodology of sample, as far as a compliance testing or control testing is concerned, use the same methodology. Then determine the change meets the following control objectives or test attributes by examining supporting evidence related to each of the tests. So these are general, but what guides you is the process that you reviewed, that you did the walkthrough. So those rules, then you remember I said for procurement, the same thing on change management. This is a cycle, change management. So understand that cycle and then identify the controls within that cycle. Majority of the time, probably most of the time, if it's not all, it has to have an authorization. So requester have to send something, say, okay, change, or let's say the change is a new report. IT director or one of the managers says, database administrator, I don't know what he's doing. I really need to remember we talked about privilege access review. I need to review his access. Currently, there's no report, then I need to create a report that shows me only that person's activity. That's a new change request. Somebody has to do that, isn't it? Compile, put together that report, technically, whatever it takes. Somebody requests it, somebody has to approve, isn't it? It could be the same person in this case, because if he's the manager or the director, but he says, okay, approve, but approval have to be shown in one way, email, signature, whatever. Do they have a form to be filled when you are requesting a change? So I need to see the documentation, but my control that I'm checking is the approval. I'm checking when the change is done, has it been tested? Once it's tested, another approval have to go and say, okay, it's fine, move now to production, meaning now it has to be on the normal production. 99% of the time, that is the process. There could be additional processes depending on the entity that they deem necessary for their risk or their goals. Then once you look, you put all your test attributes or all the different controls within the cycle, and then that's how you're going to test. We're talking here a change management or a change request. Any questions?
Given for IS, automatically that it is robust, it is an end-to-end solution. When we create the code, we code the data, we process it,
Yes.
generate a new sheet, which is able to be tinkered by human people.
Absolutely.
What is the reconcile for us?
That's what I said. Just what you explained, you say they pull from the system, they put it on a spreadsheet, isn't it? Excel, they could manipulate, or they might even do some data cleansing, and then they will give you. In order for me to know the completeness of that data, I will go back and say rerun from the system. So whatever they gave me, I will verify against the original one that they obtained from the system before they could massage or they could clean or anything. What I'm looking here is not individual transactions, isn't it? I'm looking at, because what they're massaging could be, let's say, things that are either errors or false. But what I'm looking here is the total number of transactions, completeness I'm looking of the transaction. So I will say rerun it from the system. If there is 1,000 they give me from the system, I need to get 1,000 transaction. So that is a quick check, completeness check of the population that they have given me. Then I will carry, as I said, whatever test then I needed to carry, depending on whether it's an account balances, it's other control testing. That is the best way to look at it, confirm. So sometimes the system might have a direct reports that are already designed, so you could run it. If the system doesn't have reports that they have, you could always do ask the database administrator to run SQL, because that is at the database level. Reports are always at the application level. SQL at the database level, so it automatically goes directly to the tables. In order for you to do that, or in order for them to do that, then you need to understand the fields that you're looking, something that's called data dictionary is there. If it's something that a vendor says, though, so it comes as part of the manuals. If it's a developed in-house, then whoever was developing has to create one. If they didn't, then that is one of the things that you will automatically have to recommend. They will have to do as part of the manuals, technical manuals. So once you understand the fields that you want, you could go and ask them, I need, because what you're looking at, the fields are the information you want, but the completeness, they have to run the report for you. You say, okay, these 10 fields I need, run it. When they run, then you will see, you get the information you wanted per one transaction, but you will also get how many transactions went through the database. Because when he runs the SQL, or you could even ask them, if it doesn't run right in front of you, you could ask them, show me the logic of the SQL, but then you could come back and say, rerun it. To see, or you could even say, as he's doing it, you could see, because SQL logic is something that you could easily understand. Because it might just say, get this table, or I mean, it is specific things that you could understand. Any other question? Another area is that you could look at it when you are doing the testing is segregation of duties. So validate both organizationally and logically that different individuals within the organization perform the following duties. So these are the areas that you should, that what we call conflicting duties, or that shouldn't be going together. So if somebody is requesting, remember we talked about change management, if I'm requesting something, I cannot be the same approver of what I'm requesting, especially if I'm requesting a program change, such as, like, say, a report. Somebody else, it doesn't matter whether the person is above or below, have to approve, because they have to check, is this reasonable request or not, even if I'm the director. Because remember, somebody have to say, is this reasonable or not? Somebody have to approve the what I'm asking. Basically, it segregates. I might have both, even if it's access-wise, the approval has to come through access. I might have both access, but remember, whenever approval or input and approve it's a workflow. So that workflow could be coded in a way that if I become, even though I have both privileges, if I became the requester, then it shouldn't allow the same, let's say, account to be both requester and approver. So it's easy way of setting up. So if I request, somebody else have to approve. So those two cannot go together, request and approve. Program development or program change. Also, you don't want the developer to also be able to put it into production. So developer should not have access to production, because these guys are the ones who do the code, change the codes. You don't want the production codes to be changing, so you don't want them to have access. Nobody should be touching code in the production. You change the code or anything you want to do at development environment. At minimum, entity has to have two environments, one testing and one production. Because even as a normal, even if it's what you call, if you're not developing in-house and you bought Oracle or SAP, any configuration change or any report changes or anything, because remember, there's a lot of configuration that you could do with those, or a lot of policy setting. You want to test those first in the testing environment and then move it to production. Because once the production is set up at your first implementation, any changes have to go through a change management program, and that requires item to be tested before it's moved to production. So anybody who's dealing with the testing shouldn't be the one who's moving. So there are individual people who are responsibility is just to move the code. Mostly those are made by the IT operators, because they have nothing to do with others. All they care is job scheduling. Basically for them, it's moving one file from one location to another. They don't care what the file is. They have a lot of times, idea what the issue is. You just tell them, move file name this and this to production, and they will just move it, the file. Because all those rules and setting is put it as a file. All they care is just move that file to production. So that is another area that you make sure that you segregate those duties. Configuration, the person who's doing it or developer should not have access to production environment. So in order for you to test, then once you establish which duties based on also your organizational chart and the job descriptions, once you identify the jobs that shouldn't be together, then you could obtain list of system users. A lot of times with assistant from the administrator, again, you will say, run the report, show me that it's a complete list. Once you've got that from the system, identify because that shows you what they have access to also. Assess appropriateness of access granted. If some of them has a conflict, let's say, remember we said, if I have input and approve, now I could identify that as a problem, isn't it? So I need to follow that and say, okay, does the system that they are using deny the person to be at the same time? Because in my normal, when I pull the system, users, it shows you what privilege they have. So this guy has privilege of input, privilege of approval. My second question is, the systems that he's using, let's say it's the change management system, could he be both? Now, because that system or application, how it's designed, isn't it? If he cannot be both, then it's fine. If he could be both, then I have a segregation of duty issue. Not only the person, do they have the privilege, it's not the issue. Could they use that in one time is the issue. So I need to be able to find out that. So org, as I said, org structure alone does not give me, even when I get the user access privileges alone does not give me, I need to do in comparison with how behavior, or could that person be both at the same time, like the systems that they are going to use, whether it's application, whether it's a system that is used internally as a tool to do change management. I need to know how does it work actually, in actuality. Again, as I said, if the person has both, like on the user list, and its privileges, user access, it shows me it has, but I need to check, is there any mitigating controls? Like the system that he's using, he's not able to do it. I talked about the workflow, he's not allowed to do, or she's not allowed to do, then I don't have a segregation of duty issues. If the person could use the privilege at the same transaction, then I have a problem. So I need to be able to identify the compensating controls, if there are any. Or let's say sometimes he could use, but the manager could say, we are short on people. We allowed this to happen, but I am reviewing, let's say periodically. And I know these are changes that has been approved, let's say by a committee or by something. Then it's okay. Again, that's what we call compensating control or correcting control, that they have a process to review. A lot of times when you have, remember when we said privilege access, you have to review. When you have an issue of segregation of duty, then what you need to, is like, if you could avoid at the beginning. If you cannot, based on number of people, because what creates segregation of duty? Somebody to play two roles, isn't it? Could be a manpower issue. If there's only 3 people in IT, you're bound to have segregation. That's what we talked about, inherent risk. If I know there's only 2 or 3 people, then I know that there's going to be some segregation of duties. Then now what I am thinking is not about whether they could have or not, because necessity of business created that they have to have a segregate issue. But now what I look at it is there any compensating controls? Are we reviewing any, is there any monitoring in place, is what you're looking at that stage. Is somebody monitoring them? They already have the privileges and they are using it. Is it being monitored? So they could be detected and then fixed if there's anything wrong. That's it for today. We will continue tomorrow, inshallah, for the rest of the GCC. If you have any questions, any clarifications, any comments, please ask.